She walked into the commissary like a shadow, unnoticed, unimportant, forgotten. But why did Sergeant Cooper pause when he saw the challenge coin fall from her wallet? And why was her jacket missing its patches? Rebecca Stone didn't look like much to anyone, not anymore. 52 years old, quiet, limp in her right leg. She blended into the corners of Fort Campbell like an old memory. Her jacket, faded to sage and frayed at the elbows, told stories few could hear. It wasn't just old, it was erased. Patches removed, insignias gone, color softened by hundreds of washes and years of silence. She carried herself like someone trained, not marching, but moving with a precision that civilians couldn't fake. She knew the exact rhythm of the morning. When the commissary opened, which doors stuck, which aisles were quietest, she knew how to disappear. She'd been doing it for 15 years. Inside her canvas bag, a grocery list scrawled on the back of an envelope, $47 in cash, a folded photo she never looked at, and scars, the visible kind, like the one on her wrist that ached when she reached for a high shelf, and the kind she never showed anyone. She passed the cereal aisle and felt it again, the tension in her shoulder, a reminder of a night that didn't exist on any record. The VA called it non-specific trauma, a bureaucratic phrase to fill in the blanks where her service record ended. Her file, she was once told, lacked sufficient documentation to verify deployments. She knew what that meant. No medals, no parades, no answers. Just a denial letter signed by a person who never knew what a night in the desert sounded like. She moved past young soldiers, chatting over frozen meals, their laughter loud and fast, laced with acronyms and caffeine. None of them saw her. Not really. That was fine. That was safer. Invisibility kept you from being questioned. Invisibility meant no one asked what happened in Tikrit or Mosul or that village with no name, just coordinates and a half-burned satellite photo. Her limp flared at the dairy section, and she adjusted the bag on her shoulder. Every item she bought was calculated. Milk, 2 soups, spaghetti, and a loaf of store-brand bread. No extras. Her ID still worked for the base, but not much else. There were no discounts for ghosts. She waited in line behind a young sergeant buying energy, drinks and protein bars. He didn't turn around. When her turn came, she greeted Master Sergeant Cooper with a nod. He looked at her, really looked, and saw something in her eyes. He didn't comment on her jacket, her groceries, or her silence. He just said, "Good morning, ma'am," with a respect that wasn't about appearance. She said little words. Weren't cheap. They were dangerous. Each one might reveal something, a unit, a mission, a name that still lived in a redacted file. But then it happened as she counted her bills. Something slipped from her wallet. Small, metal, worn, a challenge coin, not from a base shop, not one you could buy. It clinked against the counter. Cooper's hand froze halfway to the scanner. His eyes narrowed, just enough to say he recognized it, not fully, but enough to know it was real. Rebecca picked it up quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she slid it back into her wallet. Their eyes met. He didn't say a word, and yet everything had changed. She left with her groceries, shoulders slightly more tense. It wasn't fear. It was the old instinct, the one that told her to stay low when the wind shifted. She had almost made it to her car when she remembered her prescription, pain medication she still needed for her shoulder and leg. A small detail, but vital. She turned back, footsteps softer now, gait tighter. She didn't want to go back inside, but she had no choice. And that was when it began. A group of young officers near the entrance. Fresh uniforms, polished boots, perfect posture. West Point kids, probably. She could smell it. Entitlement and aftershave as she passed. One of them muttered loud enough for it to land. Check out the thrift store combat fashion. His name tag said Brooks, 24. Clean-cut, confident. Dangerous in the way only someone who's never been wrong can be. The woman beside him, Reed, smiled at his remark. That jacket's seen better days, she replied. Probably found it on eBay. Rebecca kept walking. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn. But something inside her shifted, a slow ember that hadn't burned in years. She waited for her refill. Behind her, the officers kept at it. Wonder what she's claiming? Desert Storm? Afghanistan? Or just a fan of the look? Bet she's heading to the VA, Brooks smirked. Stolen valor cases always end up there. Probably can't even spell Mose. Their voices weren't angry, just amused. But it was enough. Rebecca picked up her prescription, turned, and walked back toward the exit. Behind her, their laughter followed. She didn't react, but inside, she heard other voices. Corporal Garcia yelling through the radio. Move! Move! Staff Sergeant Kim bleeding out in the sand, saying, Tell my mom. Torres pulling her out of a burning vehicle with half a leg missing. They didn't get to grow old. They didn't get to wear faded jackets. They didn't get to be laughed at. And here she was, still invisible. She reached the doors and paused. Just for a moment, her hand moved to the spot on her arm where a patch used to be, a unit insignia removed long ago for operational security. The skin still remembered its shape. She turned slowly, not fully, just enough to see them through the window. The officers were still laughing, still guessing, still wrong, and then, somewhere in the distance, a black SUV pulled into the lot. No one noticed, not yet, but the flags on its bumper fluttered slightly in the Kentucky wind. Rebecca took a breath, stepped outside, and the jacket, the one they mocked, swayed gently at her side. The truth, still hidden, but not for long. What if you had to defend your honor without saying a word? Rebecca stood outside the commissary, prescription bag in one hand, grocery sack in the other. But her feet wouldn't move, not toward her car, not toward comfort. Inside, the laughter hadn't stopped. She could still hear it, not the words now, just the tone. That smugness, that certainty. It wasn't the first time, but this time, something was different, because now she wasn't just tired, she was done. She turned from her car and walked, not away, but along the sidewalk lining the glass front of the commissary, slow, controlled. Her boots made soft echoes on the concrete. Through the windows, she could see them. Brooks, Reed, a few others now clustered around. A flock of perfectly pressed uniforms with nothing to do but tear down someone who didn't fit their image of a hero. They weren't quiet anymore. One of them pointed. Another mimed a salute, mocking. The group chuckled like teenagers daring each other to cross a line. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Her fingers found the strap of her bag and squeezed. Inside, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had heard enough. She stood near the frozen foods, silent, watching. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, and in the tone of those officers, she didn't just hear arrogance. She heard danger, the kind that comes when ignorance meets power. Then one of the officers said it out loud. If she was real, she'd come back in here and say something. Reed grinned. Exactly. Real veterans don't hide when asked to prove themselves. Rebecca reached her car, opened the trunk, set her bags inside, and stood there, frozen. 15 years of silence. 15 years of being told her service didn't exist. Her pain wasn't real. Her records didn't match. 15 years of hiding. Because classified meant invisible. And yet, would Torres have walked away? Would Kim have backed down? Would Garcia have let some lieutenant mock a fellow soldier without stepping in? She already knew the answer. Rebecca closed the trunk. She turned, and she began walking back, her pace calm, her face unreadable. Inside the commissary, the young officers gathered near the entrance. They hadn't expected a response. They had expected a retreat. But now, the woman in the faded jacket was coming back, and she wasn't alone. A black SUV slowed outside the building. It bore the quiet insignia of senior command. Subtle flags on the bumper. Government plates, darkened windows, Nobody noticed, not at first. But the moment the doors opened, the shift was instant. The air changed, the chatter died, and every enlisted soldier and officer who spotted the man stepping out stood straighter, because standing on the curb now was General William Hayes, 4 stars. On his shoulders, years of service in his eyes. His presence didn't need introduction. He walked like a man used to command, not with arrogance. But gravity, a man who didn't ask for silence, he just walked in and received it. Colonel Walsh followed behind him, arms full of a short grocery list. "Sir, I believe something's going on," she said under her breath, eyeing the crowd. "Inside. I see it," the general replied. He stepped through the automatic doors. The sound of his boots on tile was the only thing anyone could hear, and at that exact moment, Rebecca reached the entrance again, just as Brooks and his group turned to intercept her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Brooks said, loud and clear, his tone rehearsed. "We were hoping to ask you a few questions about your military service." The whole commissary froze. Customers stopped moving. Staff paused mid-scan. Even the background music seemed to fade. Reed stepped up beside him. "That jacket you're wearing, it's military issue. We're just trying to verify service. You understand? Stolen valor is a real issue." Rebecca looked from one face to another. Her shoulders were still, her voice calm. "I served." It was all she said, but Brooks wasn't satisfied. "Where? When? What unit?" "That's classified," she replied, steady. Chuckles rippled through the officers. Reed rolled her eyes. "Ma'am, we're not trying to embarrass you." "No," Rebecca cut in. "You're trying to expose me. You think service comes with a label you can scan, that if it's not in a file, it didn't happen." "We're just asking for documentation," Brooks said, voice sharper now. "If you have nothing to hide." "Enough." The word came from behind them, firm, clear, heavy. They turned and saw him, General Hayes, standing 15 feet away, hands clasped behind his back. Watching, the shift was instant. Reed snapped to attention. Brooks stiffened, eyes widening. Hayes walked forward, slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Brooks. He didn't look at Reed. He looked at Rebecca. And in that moment, recognition bloomed in his face. He saw not the jacket, not the age, not the groceries. He saw the night, the fire, the sand, the chaos. The voice that had said, "Colonel, we're not leaving you behind. Captain Stone," he said quietly. Rebecca turned. Eyes locking with his 15 years collapsed in a heartbeat. She nodded once, a soldier's nod, and General Hayes saluted. The air in the commissary cracked like thunder. Every officer, every soldier, every civilian frozen. The woman they'd questioned, the one they had mocked, the one they had cornered, was being saluted by a 4-star general. Rebecca raised her hand slowly, returned the salute, not as a civilian, not as a ghost, but as the soldier she had always been. When Hayes finally dropped his hand, he turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice carrying without effort. "This woman led a classified operation in 2008 that saved 37 American lives, including mine." Brooks' knees almost buckled. Reed's face went pale. Hayes continued, "You may not find her record in the system. You may not see her medals, but that's because some missions never make it to the books." Silence, then a murmur, then a wave, heads nodding, hearts sinking, eyes filled with realization. Rebecca looked at the young officers, not with hate, not with anger, but with something more difficult. Understanding, because she had once been like them. Too certain, too proud. But now they would learn just like she had. How do you respond when the truth arrives wearing 4 stars and a memory you tried to bury? No one moved. General Hayes stood between the crowd and Rebecca Stone, a wall of recognition shielding her from the sting of mockery that had filled the air just moments before. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even the checkout beeps had stopped, like the commissary itself was holding its breath. Lieutenant Brooks, pale now, cleared his throat. "Sir, we didn't know." Hayes turned. His gaze wasn't angry. It was heavier than that. It was disappointed. "You didn't know," he said slowly, "because you didn't care to find out. You saw a jacket and decided you saw everything, but you missed the most important part." He gestured gently toward Rebecca. "You missed the weight it carries." Reed stepped forward, her voice lower now, almost breaking. "We only wanted to make sure. No one disrespected the uniform, and in doing that," Hayes said, "you disrespected the uniform." The officers stood frozen, unable to speak. General Hayes turned back to the silent crowd, and then he began to speak, not as a general, but as a man who owed his life to a woman whose name had been buried in classified files for 15 years. 15 years ago, he said, I was a colonel assigned to a diplomatic security mission in Iraq. It was supposed to be routine, but our intelligence was compromised. Our location was surrounded by Iranian-backed militias. We had no radio, no exit, and 3 wounded. We were out of options. He looked toward Rebecca, his voice softening, but she wasn't. The room leaned in. She led a 6-person team, Task Force Nighthawk. Their mission was so classified. I wasn't even cleared to know their names after the extraction. They came in under radio silence, they drew enemy fire, and 3 of her teammates never came home. Rebecca lowered her eyes. She could still feel it. The sand, the blood, the heat of the explosion when Kim took the brunt of the blast. Torres pulling her behind a wall, already missing half a leg. Garcia's last breath in her ear. Go, I got this. Their faces still visited her in sleep. Hayes continued. This woman, Captain Stone, held the line while we evacuated. She walked wounded, shoulder torn, leg barely working, and she made damn sure none of us were left behind, if not for her. I wouldn't be standing here. A murmur spread through the crowd. The shape of the story was forming. The truth was no longer silent. Her service was buried under a mountain of security, Hayes said. That's the cost of certain missions. The world will never know what they did. But I remember, and it's time someone said it aloud. He turned to Rebecca, his voice steady. Captain Stone, I apologize on behalf of the United States Army for the way you were treated today. Rebecca looked up, blinking back a sting behind her eyes. Sir, it's not necessary. It is, he interrupted. Recognition delayed is still recognition. But silence breaks people. Rebecca swallowed hard. For 15 years, her silence had kept the world safe. But it had also kept her in shadows. No rank, no thanks, no closure. That weight didn't come off with the jacket at night. It stayed. Hayes turned to the crowd once more. You've all seen what happened here today. Let it teach you something. Not all battles end with medals. Not all heroes stand in the spotlight. Some serve where light can't go and return without glory. But that doesn't make them less. The room stood still then. Staff Sergeant Santos stepped forward, quiet, sincere. Captain Stone, she said softly, I'm sorry. Others followed, a corporal, a retired vet, a civilian spouse who whispered, Thank you for what you did. Even Master Sergeant Cooper stepped out from behind the register, challenge coins still in mind, and gave her a solemn nod. But it wasn't the gestures that got her. It was that they finally saw her. For the first time in 15 years, Rebecca wasn't invisible. Brooks and Reed stood before her, their confidence gone, replaced by something more honest. Remorse, ma'am, Brooks said. I judged you without knowing anything. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Rebecca studied his face. It would be easy to humiliate him, but she had led men in war. She knew redemption mattered more than revenge. What did you learn? She asked. Brooks blinked. That service comes in forms I don't understand, and that silence doesn't mean absence. She nodded once, then turned to Reed. Reed hesitated. Her voice broke slightly. Ma'am, I've never served outside logistics, but today, I realized I know nothing about what real sacrifice looks like. I'll remember. That. Rebecca's reply was quiet, but it landed like thunder. Good, because one day, someone like me might work for you, and how you see them will change everything. General Hayes stepped forward again. You'll both submit written reports to your commanding officers. You'll research veterans with classified service, and you'll work with me personally on policy recommendations. Understood? Yes, sir. And you'll apologize again, privately, not because it's protocol, but because it's right. Yes, sir. The tension broke slightly. A child nearby whispered to their mom, "Why are they clapping for that lady?" The mother smiled, because she's the kind of soldier who keeps people safe, even if nobody ever knows it. Rebecca's breath caught. The moment was big, overwhelming, but it wasn't about pride. It was about letting go of years that had clung. Like armor, Hayes looked at her. Captain, will you join me for lunch? There's more we need to discuss. A lot more. Rebecca looked at the people around her, the ones who had once looked through her and now stood beside her. She looked at Brooks and Reed, mistakes in progress, and she thought of Garcia, of Kim, of Torres, and whispered, almost to herself, they deserved this moment too. Then, louder, I'd be honored. Sir. They walked out together, a general and a ghost, finally seen outside. The air was still. Sunlight touched the edge of the sidewalk. No salutes now, no music, just the quiet echo of dignity. Rising. What happens when the world finally hears the truth you've carried in silence? Rebecca sat across from General Hayes at a quiet table in the base officers' mess, sunlight pouring through a window that overlooked Fort Campbell's distant fields. A place designed for generals, colonels, men in decorated uniforms, not invisible veterans in thrift store jeans and jackets with missing patches. She didn't quite know where to rest her hands. Her coffee sat untouched. Hayes broke the silence. Gently, how long have you been carrying this alone? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him, not at the room, but at memory. 15 years since the mission, she said. 10 years of appeal denials. 3 years of temp security jobs. 5 psychiatrists who couldn't help because they didn't have clearance. She looked him in the eye. I've memorized the layout of VA offices better than I know my own apartment. Hayes nodded slowly. And the others? The families of Garcia, Torres, and Kim. They were told it was a training accident, she said softly. Garcia's mother sent me a letter once. I couldn't reply. Her voice cracked at the edges. I used to write responses I never mailed. The general looked down, guilt tightening his jaw. They deserve to know. They deserve the truth, Rebecca agreed. But the system we served, it doesn't allow that. Not when files don't exist. Not when even your therapist can't know what to ask for. A long moment, they sat in the quiet weight of it. Then Hayes straightened. The soldier in him re-engaged. That ends now, Rebecca tilted her head. Sir? He pulled out a small folder from his bag. Slim, government-sealed. I've spoken to senior command. I've already made a call to the Department of Defense. Your file is flagged for partial declassification under Directive 77 Bravo. I'm signing off on it personally. Rebecca blinked. She'd stopped believing such a thing could even happen. I didn't think. Your story matters, Captain. What happened in Iraq saved lives, including mine. And those lives left a debt I intend to repay. Not just for you, but for every silent veteran who came home to bureaucratic walls instead of welcome mats. He opened the folder. Inside were authorization forms, draft briefs, and a signed letter. Your rank will be restored, Hayes said. Your benefits, backdated and corrected. You'll receive the proper citations for Operation Desert Shield. And your records will include acknowledgement of your injuries. That means medical coverage, mental health support, and... He paused. A platform. Rebecca exhaled. Not in triumph, in disbelief. After all this time, someone wasn't just seeing her. They were giving her the tools to be whole again. Still, part of her hesitated. "Sir," she said quietly. "What? About the others like me? The ones still hiding behind classified?" "That's why I want your help," he replied. "Not just to fix your file, but to build a bridge for the ones who can't speak yet." A long silence passed. Then Rebecca nodded, not like a civilian being offered a favor, like a soldier accepting a mission. "What do you need me to do?" Within 2 weeks, Rebecca was back on base, not shopping for soup or avoiding eye contact, but sitting at a table in a secure meeting room beside Colonel Walsh and a panel of senior advisors. The general's words had become action, and action had created something no one had anticipated. Movement. They called it the ECHO Task Force. Its mission? To identify, support, and reintegrate veterans whose service was buried under layers of classified designations. People who lived in silence because policy had no language for them. Rebecca sat quietly during that first meeting, listening, watching. They debated protocols, liaison roles, clearance levels, policy changes. And when it was her turn to speak, she said only this: "If you build a system that starts with doubt, you'll never reach truth. Build it with trust." Heads nodded, and things began to shift. 3 weeks later, she stood in front of a classroom at the Army War College. 25 senior officers stared back, all in uniform, all with ranks that once might have intimidated her now. She wasn't here to be approved. She was here to be heard. "Good morning," she said, voice even. "I'm Rebecca Stone, former captain, Task Force Nighthawk, Operation Desert Shield." A pause. "You won't find that in your handouts." The room stiffened. They knew the story by now. Word had spread. "Today," she continued, "I'm not here to tell war stories. I'm here to talk about what happens when we let our own fall through the cracks because their stories don't fit on a spreadsheet." She clicked the remote. A slide appeared. 5 bullet points, no names, just phrases. Non-verifiable injuries VA. Claim denials, isolation indicators, suicide risk by clearance level, internal identity fracture. "This," she said, "is what happens when someone like me comes home and finds that the war doesn't end. It just becomes quieter." She scanned the room. "There are hundreds, maybe thousands like me. We operated in silos of secrecy. We returned to a world that didn't know us. And when we reached for help, there was no hand there, just a locked door." A colonel in the back raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we find these veterans?" Rebecca smiled faintly. "You don't find them. You create conditions where they find you." That moment changed something. From that day forward, she wasn't just a speaker. She became an advisor, an advocate, a kata, builder of new ground. Back at home, she still lived in the same apartment, still drove the same 15-year-old Honda, still walked with a slight limp, but the silence no longer echoed the same. Her grocery list now shared space with draft memos and committee notes. Her folded photo now hung framed beside her bed. 5 faces in desert camo. Finally seen. She called Garcia's mother and told her the truth. She met with Torres' sister in a small diner and gave her the medal that had been boxed in a drawer for over a decade. She sat with Staff Sergeant Kim's daughter, now 16, and told her what real courage looked like. And then, one evening, while preparing a presentation for a congressional subcommittee, she looked up from her laptop and stared at the challenge coin beside her coffee mug, the same one Sergeant Cooper had seen fall on the commissary counter. It was dull now, worn smooth by time, but its weight? Still the same. She turned it over. The inscription, faded but clear, read, "Not for praise, for purpose." Rebecca closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't just surviving her past. She was shaping someone else's future. What does honor look like when it arrives late? and still isn't enough. Rebecca stood behind the podium in a windowless conference room at the Department of Veterans Affairs headquarters in D.C. Her voice echoed softly across the mahogany walls. The room was filled with VA officials, policy directors, and military liaisons, most of whom had only heard of Captain Rebecca Stone from recent headlines and internal briefings. But now she wasn't just a name. She was the proof. In front of them, "You don't get a ribbon for surviving bureaucracy," she said calmly, "but you do deserve a way through it." Click. She advanced her slide. A series of redacted documents appeared on the screen. No record of deployment, no documented injury, no psychiatric clearance granted. This was my file. This is what the VA saw when I asked for help. They didn't see the shrapnel in my shoulder. They didn't hear the gunfire in my sleep. They saw an empty folder and told me to wait. Her eyes scanned the crowd. But silence doesn't mean absence, and classified doesn't mean imaginary. The room sat in stillness. One senior official, a man who had worked at the VA for over 20 years, slowly raised his hand. "Captain Stone, how many other veterans do you believe are out there in situations like yours?" Rebecca didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a folded paper from her blazer pocket and opened it carefully. On it were 17 names, 17 initials, all given to her in private, in confidence, by other veterans since the day at the commissary. 17, she said, in the last 3 weeks alone. "And those are just the ones who found me." The room shifted. They understood now. This wasn't anecdotal. This was systemic. That night, she sat in a quiet corner of her hotel room, staring at the city lights through a half-open window. The hum of traffic below, the occasional siren, the thrum of a life she had never quite learned how to join. In front of her, a laptop screen glowed with half-written notes for the legislation General Hayes was preparing to endorse, the Classified Veterans Recognition Act. But Rebecca wasn't writing. She was thinking about Torres. She remembered his voice, calm, steady, the kind of soldier who always found a way forward, even if it meant carrying someone else's pack for them. He would have loved this fight. He would have volunteered to be the face of it. And he died in the dirt so she could carry it instead. The guilt never really left. You just learned how to walk with it. 1 week later, she stood in front of a different kind of audience. A circle of veterans seated in folding chairs at a support group just outside Fort Campbell. No uniforms here, no rank, no formality, just worn jeans, caps with fading unit patches, coffee cups half full, and hands that occasionally shook. Rebecca looked around the circle, and then, slowly, she took off her jacket underneath her blouse. Sleeves were rolled slightly. The scars on her wrist caught the fluorescent light. One man leaned forward. "I know those," he said softly. "Mine look the same? Nerve reconstruction?" She nodded. The circle changed after that. Stories began to flow, carefully, then freely. Men and women who had served in programs without names, whose benefits had been denied for years, who had kept their pain quiet because it didn't match the records, were finally being heard. One woman whispered through tears, "I used to think I made it all up, that the mission didn't happen because they said it didn't." Rebecca looked her in the eyes. "You didn't make it up," she said. "You lived it. And now we're going to make sure no one else ever has to question that again." Over the next month, Rebecca became something she never expected. A symbol. She was featured in military journals, invited to speak on panels, consulted on new VA policies being quietly rolled out under classified clearance protocols. Congress was watching. Change was happening. Slow, deliberate, but undeniable. Still, there were nights the weight returned. Nights when the recognition felt wrong, like it had come too late, like it should have been Garcia at the mic, not her. Like the applause was misplaced. One evening, after a particularly emotional speaking engagement, she stood outside a local high school where she had just addressed a group of young ROTC cadets. The air was cool, Crisp, autumn leaves scraped across the sidewalk. A young cadet, no more than 17, approached her, wide-eyed. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "are you really the one from the video? The woman the general saluted?" She hesitated, then nodded. He looked down, nervous, then lifted his eyes again. "My sister. She served Afghanistan intel. She doesn't talk about it much, doesn't even go to the VA. Says no one believes her." Rebecca's heart twisted. "What's her name?" she asked gently. He told her. Rebecca pulled out a notepad and scribbled down her contact. "Give this to her. Tell her she's not alone." He took the paper carefully, like it was something sacred, and then, as he turned to go, he said one last thing that stuck with her all night. "She never smiled about it, not once, but if she saw you, I think she would." The next morning, Rebecca drove past the Fort Campbell gates, not to shop, not to prove herself, but to meet with the new Echo Task Force officers for their first field coordination meeting. And as she walked through the same entrance where it all began, she noticed something small but unforgettable. The young lieutenant at the front desk stood up when he saw her, and he saluted, not performative, not loud, just quiet acknowledgement, like she belonged. Rebecca nodded once. In return, because for the first time in 15 years, she did. What do you do when the past you buried walks into the room, wearing a name you thought you'd never say again? The round table was closed door. 5 officers, 3 civilians, 2 classified observers. One purpose: to discuss the psychological cost of undeclared service. Rebecca sat near the window. The blinds were half drawn, but she could still see the flag outside, limp in the windless morning. She hadn't slept much. These meetings always took more than they gave, not because of the policies, but because of the memories they stirred. Today's session was part of an internal audit commissioned by General Hayes, a review of covert trauma response protocols for soldiers whose missions never made it to their discharge paperwork. It wasn't for media, it wasn't even public knowledge, but it mattered. So Rebecca showed up every time, even when it hurt, even when her fingers trembled slightly on the table, even when the folder in front of her held a page that said, redacted 13 times in a single paragraph. The moderator spoke first. "Captain Stone, we're grateful for your continued involvement. We'd like to begin today by reviewing psychological recovery barriers for operators without clearance to discuss their service, even with VA clinicians. You mentioned in your last debrief that the silence was a second battlefield." Rebecca looked around the table. Faces she didn't know, credentials, rank. But they weren't the ones she was speaking to. She was speaking to Torres, to Garcia, to Kim. "I was treated for PTSD," she began, "but I couldn't explain why. Every time I started to describe what happened, the therapist would stop me. Clearance issues, privacy regulations. I learned to speak around my trauma instead of through it." She swallowed. "Eventually, I stopped trying." A colonel across from her, lean, early 40s, with a security badge clipped to his lapel, leaned forward. "Is that what you think broke you?" Rebecca's voice was steady. "No. What broke me was realizing I wasn't allowed to grieve." Silence fell across the room like dust. No one interrupted. Then the door opened behind them. A new attendee entered. Rebecca didn't look up right away, not until she heard a voice she hadn't heard in over a decade. "Apologies. I was rerouted from CENTCOM." Her heart stopped. She turned slowly. And there, standing at the door, was Major Eleanor Voss, Voss sniper, tactician, medical cross-trained, once the calm within chaos, the one who held Garcia's wrist when he bled out, the one who pulled Rebecca from a collapsing rooftop. While bullets chewed through concrete inches from their necks, Voss, who was supposed to have died in an extraction mission 4 months after Tikrit, but now, standing alive, changed, older, but undeniably her. For a long second, no one breathed. Then, Rebecca stood, slowly, Eleanor? Voss's eyes met hers, and the ears folded like paper. Hey, Stone, she said, voice soft but unshaken. Still quoting regulation when you're mad? A breathless laugh slipped from Rebecca's mouth. The moderator blinked. You two serve together? Voss answered, classified, but yes. No one spoke for a moment. Then Rebecca reached out, and the two women embraced. Tight and wordless, when they sat again, something had shifted. The air felt different. Like memory had grown bones and walked into the light after the session. They walked together across the base grounds. Quiet, slow steps that said more than words could. You were reported Kia, Rebecca said finally. Breaking the silence, I was, replied. Technically, third extraction team pulled me out after our bird went down. Mission was sealed before I got stabilized. I spent a year in recovery. Another 2 training ghost units. Why didn't you reach out? I was told you didn't want contact, that you were out. I didn't know. Rebecca looked at the sky. It was pale blue, soft clouds drifting. A strange backdrop for the realization that someone you mourned had never died. Garcia's mother. Still thinks you all died in a fuel fire. I know, Voss said. Her voice was quieter. Now, that's why I'm back. I've been working with Hayes on disclosure protocols. We're building a pathway for Gold Star families tied to Black. Ops missions, it's overdue. Rebecca nodded, but something sat heavy on her chest. They gave me medals, she said. They gave me files. They gave me a voice. But I still don't sleep through the night. I still wake up gripping the side of my mattress, like it's a rifle sling. Voss didn't offer comfort. She offered truth. Then say it louder. She said, because the next soldier might not wake up at all. They sat on a concrete bench overlooking the training fields. A class of new recruits ran in the distance. Lean, shouting, alive. Voss pulled something from her pocket. A photo, torn on the edges. It showed all 6 of them back in Iraq. No helmets, some blasted, dirty, smiling. Kim had his arm over Garcia's shoulder. Torres was half laughing, mid-joke. Rebecca's eyes filled before she could stop it. I thought this was lost. I carried it, Voss said. Through 4 assignments, through every reassignment. Because forgetting them felt like a second death. Rebecca reached out and took the photo gently. Not just as memory, but as inheritance. Later that week, Rebecca and Voss co-led their first closed trauma forum, a room of 10 veterans. Each with clearance conflicts and denied claims. They didn't sit at a podium. They sat in a circle. No rank, no uniforms, only voices. One man spoke about a child he couldn't save. Another woman talked about how she tried to apply for benefits, only to be told her most didn't exist. Rebecca didn't offer solutions. She offered something better, understanding, and Voss. She told her story for the first time, about surviving a black site prison, about the weeks before her rescue, about the ache of being dead on paper but alive in pain. When the meeting ended, no one clapped. But no one walked out alone either. That night, Rebecca sat at her desk. She stared at the photo Voss had given her. She picked up her pen and wrote 5 letters. 1 to Garcia's mother, 1 to Kim's daughter, 1 to Torres' sister, 1 to General Hayes, and 1 to herself. They weren't reports. They were confessions, not of weakness, but of endurance, because silence had once protected her. But now? Now, her voice was saving others. What do you do when even your healing becomes a battlefield? It started quietly. Rebecca stopped sleeping again. Not all at once, but in thin layers. First the early morning hours disappeared, then the late ones. She started skipping breakfast. Her coffee got darker. Her pen moved slower. And the photo Voss gave her stayed face down on her desk for a week. The meetings hadn't slowed. The press requests were growing. A podcast interview here, a live panel there, policy memos, follow-up reports, secure calls with the Joint Committee. On Veterans Affairs, her name was being used for change. Yes, for good, but also for narrative. And the more she heard herself mentioned in summaries, spotlights, and Senate briefings, the more hollow it began to feel, because none of those people were there when Torres took his last breath. None of them had heard Garcia scream through the static, "Just go!" before the blast came. None of them had to deliver their legacy without being able to say their names. And now they wanted to write hers into policy. Not wrong, just heavy. Too heavy. One night, at 2:41 a.m., Rebecca stood barefoot in her small kitchen. She held a glass of water she hadn't sipped from in an hour. The ceiling fan hummed quietly. Outside, a soft rain fell. Her phone buzzed, unknown caller. She stared at it, let it ring 4 times, and answered. "Stone," she said. Voice low. There was a pause. Then a voice. Tired. Female. Hesitant. "Is this Captain Stone?" "From Tikrit?" Rebecca blinked. "Who's calling?" I don't know if I should have. I got your number from someone in the Echo Task Force. They said you might understand." Rebecca's voice softened. "Talk to me." The woman on the line didn't identify herself. Not fully, but she spoke for 35 minutes. She was a former drone analyst. She had spent 2 years directing kill boxes in Pakistan from a dark room in Virginia. She hadn't seen the blood, just the pixels, but it haunted her just the same. She tried therapy. They told her she wasn't in combat. She tried the VA. They told her there was no record of stress-inducing assignments. She tried family. They told her she had a good job and should be grateful. "But I can't sleep," she whispered, "and I don't want to live in this skin anymore." Rebecca leaned against the counter, closed her eyes, and replied, "I've been there." The woman wept, and somewhere between the tears, Rebecca felt her own armor crack, not because she was weak, but because she'd forgotten how heavy all of this had become. 2 days later, Rebecca canceled all public engagements for the next month. The inbox buzzed. Reporters asked questions. Policy aides scrambled, but she didn't explain. She didn't have to. Healing isn't linear, and silence isn't surrender. She drove west, 12 hours straight. No music, just the road. She ended up near the Smoky Mountains, in a small cabin rented under a fake name she hadn't used since Kandahar. The air was clean. No briefings, no paperwork. Just trees and the soft rattle of wind on old shutters. For 3 days, she didn't speak to anyone. She reread the letters she'd written. The one to herself felt heavier now, like it had waited for this silence to be heard. "You are not a headline. You are not a file. You are not just the worst day you survived." On the 4th morning, her phone buzzed again. This time, she almost didn't answer. But something told her to. It was General Hayes. He didn't ask where she was. Didn't demand an update. He just said, "I thought you should know. The bill passed committee this morning. Unanimously. It's going to the floor next week." Rebecca breathed. "Good," she said quietly. "There's more," Hayes added. "There's a ceremony planned. Not for you, for your unit." She froze. "They want to give recognition posthumously. Garcia, Torres, Kim, their names will go into the classified honors archive." "Why now?" she asked. "Because someone lit the match," he replied. "You?" She didn't say anything at first. Then, "I'm not coming to the ceremony." "I didn't expect you to," he said. "But I thought you should know." "Their families will." Rebecca's voice wavered. "Do they know the truth?" "They know enough," Hayes said. "We couldn't tell them everything, but we told them their sons didn't die in a fire. They died saving lives, and they weren't alone." The cabin stayed quiet after the call ended. Rebecca stepped outside and watched the fog roll over the hills. She thought about that drone analyst, about every file that didn't exist, about the ones who came home and never found their name on a wall. And then, slowly, she walked back inside, took out a yellow legal pad, and wrote 3 words at the top. "The Invisible War." It would be the title of her testimony, the one she hadn't written yet, the one she was finally ready to give. Not as a veteran, not even as an advocate, but as a witness. Can dignity exist without applause? 3 weeks later, the House passed the bill unanimously. The Classified Veterans Recognition Act was signed into law on a rainy Tuesday morning. Far from headlines, without ceremony, it changed no holidays, named no bridges, promised no medals, but it changed everything for those whose service had been sealed in silence. Veterans with unlisted deployments could now appeal for identity verification through a secure channel. Families of the fallen could request classified memorial reviews. The VA could authorize clinicians to access trauma markers, even in redacted records. It didn't fix the past, but it named it, and sometimes naming something is the first real act of justice. Rebecca didn't attend the signing. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked alone through a cemetery on the outskirts of Lexington. Far from D.C., far from the base, far from where anyone might recognize her. Her boots pressed gently through the dew-soaked grass. She stopped near 3 plaques, small, government-issued, their inscriptions clean but cold. Kim, Torres, Garcia. No fanfare, no folded flags today. Just silence. She knelt slowly, her knee, brushing wet earth, reached into her coat pocket and placed something on each grave. 3 identical coins, smooth, worn, quiet, each engraved with the same words. Not for praise, for purpose. She stayed there for a long time, not crying, not talking, just remembering. Weeks later, the VA invited her to a closed symposium. No cameras, no press, just one room, one microphone, and a dozen men and women in uniform, some still active, some freshly retired, all with faces that had seen too much. Rebecca stood at the front. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't proud. She was clear. I used to think silence was protection, she began. That hiding meant healing. That classified meant invisible. A long pause. But the truth is, silence is just another kind of wound, one that never bleeds, but never closes. She looked around the room. You don't have to speak if you are not ready, but if you are, we'll listen. A woman in the back stood slowly. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it. Where do we start? Rebecca nodded. Right here. That night, she sat alone on the bleachers of an empty training field. The sky above was dark, moonless. The only light came from a row of lamps along the perimeter fence. Soft, amber. Footsteps approached. She didn't turn around. She already knew the rhythm. Voss sat beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. No ceremony today? Rebecca smirked faintly. Had one already. She gestured to the sky. This is enough. Voss handed her a cup. They sat in silence for a while. Then Voss asked a question neither of them had dared until now. Do you think they'd be proud of us? Rebecca looked up. The stars had finally come out, slow, quiet, unannounced. They wouldn't care about the law, she said. They'd want to know we remembered. And then, softer, I think we did. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca quietly stepped back from the spotlight. Her work continued, quieter, deeper, under the radar. She trained new advocates. She mentored clinicians on trauma-specific cases. She sat with families who still had more questions than answers, but she no longer needed the world to know her name, because now the names that mattered were finally known one day. While leaving the commissary, the same one where it all began, she noticed a woman in her mid-50s standing in line, wearing an old field jacket, the kind people used to whisper about. 2 young soldiers looked at her, paused, and one of them nodded respectfully. No smirks, no challenge, just acknowledgement. Rebecca smiled, not at them, at how far things had come. Outside, she walked to her car, placed the bags in the trunk, and paused, looking up at the clear sky. She remembered her very first deployment, how the night before she'd stood under a sky just like this, 22 years old, shaking with fear, clutching her rifle and wondering what kind of woman she'd have to become to survive. Now she knew, not louder, not stronger, just steadier. Because some wars end, and some echo, and some remake the world in silence. She placed her hand over the jacket. Still the same one. Still faded. Still real. And now, finally, no one questioned it. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply stands, quiet, weathered, seen and saluted.